Chapter 7, A Home in Cornwall. The naked bodies on the bed, sweaty and exhausted, after an intense session of sex. Slowly Lord Melbourne slipped to the side, pulling off Catherine, and they both caught their breath. After a couple of minutes Lord Melbourne got out of bed slowly and he walked naked to the window, taking a robe that was on a chair and covering himself with it, while he turned his back on Catherine who lay still on the bed. Lord Melbourne tied the ties around his waist, closing his robe and covering his nakedness completely. Then he turned to see Catherine, though from the look on his face she imagined that his mind was elsewhere. "If you allow me to say so, my lord, I see you as distressed as the night we met. Does that mean you still has problems with the woman you loves?" Catherine asked affectionately, with sincere interest and compassion for him. "Yes. I'm sorry that every time we see each other, you have to see me in this state of mind. I'm a bad company," Lord Melbourne said with some embarrassment, apologetic. "Do not worry, my lord. To tell you the truth, I would say that your company is very pleasurable to me, absolutely pleasurable," Catherine replied with lasciviousness in her voice and her eyes, excited as she remembered the moments of pleasure in Lord Melbourne's arms and of those who could bear witness certain parts sore from her body. "As for your pain, do not worry, I'm honored that you trust me for unburden yourself, as if I really were your friend. You do not know how many times I have wanted that men in your position to see me as a person, as a human being with feelings like their own, and not simply as an object to use and discard. I understand, but deep down, I'm a scoundrel for your services," Lord Melbourne answered sadly and with a bitter smile. "My lord, I do not judge because I do not like to be judged. In addition, the natural instincts of a man or a woman should not be a reason for censure or shame. I do not necessarily blame a man for resorting to the services of a prostitute, because after all he is only sating a natural appetite in him. What I censure is that a man treats cruelly a woman only for being a prostitute, who treats her as an object and not a person with feelings, humiliates her or causes pain her. But fortunately not all clients treat poorly girls, most are quite civilized and some are even kind and generous, just like you," Catherine said. "Thank you, it comforts me a little that you think so," said Lord Melbourne. Catherine moved on the bed and sat on the edge, putting her feet on the floor. Shamelessly, she was sitting in front of Lord Melbourne, totally naked, and Lord Melbourne could not help but a small smile between nervous and lascivious. She smiled back and, with slow, flirtatious movements, took a robe beside her, and elegantly covering herself with it, on without standing up, partially covering her nakedness. "I have discovered that men cannot think, speak, and see a naked woman at the same time. They cannot concentrate on more than one thing at a time, especially if there is a naked woman involved," Catherine said mockingly. Lord Melbourne laughed, and Catherine too. "Then my lord, do you still have doubts about the lady you love?" Catherine asked with genuine interest and sympathy. "Yes," Lord Melbourne answered with a sigh. "I'm afraid so. Now maybe more than before. I have known something more of her feelings for the other man, and the way that, in which she," he added, but could not finish the sentence. "In which she gave her virtue him," Catherine said affectionately and sympathetically. "Do not worry, my lord, I understand that it is difficult for you to speak of this. My lord, may I tell you something?" "Of course," said Lord Melbourne. "In our previous meeting I related you how I became pregnant as a young girl, and that the father of my son was a rat who seduced me and abandoned me. Well, when that bastard was courting me, there was another boy from my town who was also trying to woo me. He was a very kind and kind-hearted man, a hard-working, honest man, and he was not really an ugly boy. He had a certain physical appeal, but the other boy, the scoundrel, was much more handsome. He was more fun and charming, he knew how to talk to a girl and seduce her, while the other boy was much more timid and I found him a bit silly and boring. So I ignored the good guy, and let myself be seduced by the scoundrel. The rest of the story you already know, as my father threw me out of the house and the rest. Well, The fact is that a couple of years later I went to visit a town near my hometown, and at a local party I saw that boy who had been so good to me. I approached him, with some joy and enthusiasm, but he rejected me. He treated me with poorly concealed contempt, as if I were a repulsive being. Few times in my life have I been hurt and humiliated so much," said Catherine, sadly remembering. "I'm very sorry, really," Lord Melbourne replied with sincere sympathy. "Do not worry, it's been a long time since that. The fact is that he despised me and did not even want to give me the opportunity to be his friend. And all because I had been dishonored, dirty before his eyes, and because I dragged a son as a reminder of my shame. We went separate ways, and I dedicated myself to being a prostitute, and he married an honored woman, but with that he has not been happy. From what they tell me friends in common, that woman made of his life a hell, so much that they have separated. So I have sometimes thought that if he had forgotten his prejudices and given me a second chance, maybe our life together would have been happy, or not, we will never know," Catherine said with some pity. "I understand what you mean, that sometimes we refuse a second chance for not wanting to forgive and forget the past, and for not wanting to get rid of prejudices. And you're very right. But I'm very confused, I do not know what to feel or what to think. Sometimes I feel that I just want to love her and protect her, that I can forget what she did and love her without expecting anything in return. Recently I even had to face others for her and protect her in a complex situation for her, and then I forgot my anger. But then I had that conversation with her and well, I was shaken by the pain, the jealousy, and the insecurity. I honestly do not know if I know her, I do not know if I know the woman I fell in love with, or if what I saw in her was only a mirage, an illusion. I never believed that she was capable of making the mistake she committed, for many extenuating circumstances that may exist in her case. I still cannot believe it," Lord Melbourne replied with sadness and some anguish. "My lord, I do not want to offend the woman you love by comparing her with a woman of my condition, but we have something in common, all women, from the best to the worst, is that when we are very young, we are very reckless and we act for irresponsible impulses. If, when I was a young lady, I would have had the maturity and the experience I have now, and that I have obtained with so much pain, I probably would not have been so stupid and would not have let myself be seduced by that bastard, by my son's father, and my life would be very different now." "We've all been young and stupid, my lord," Catherine comforted. I know, Catherine. I am also a good example of how stupid we all are when we are young, believe me. My youth was filled with great and terrible mistakes in my personal life, and you do not believe I cannot understand her. What she did it partly because of her inexperience and her innocence. If I am fair, I must admit that she was not guilty totally, and not even him. But, what torments me, it is the reason that led to that situation, and that reason is that she loved him. I wanted to deceive myself, I wanted to believe that she was with him out of spite, because she could not be with me, so foolish and conceited I am," explained Lord Melbourne. "I do not think you are conceited and much less foolish, my lord. You are simply a man in love who clings to the hope that the woman you loves will continue to love you," Catherine replied with an affectionate smile. "It's possible. But the point is that she loved him and wanted him, she wanted to be his wife, she really wanted him. Then what place did I occupy in her heart? What happened to the love she said she felt for me before he entered her life? Maybe it died, maybe never existed," lamented Lord Melbourne. "Or perhaps it survived hidden in a corner of her heart. Or maybe it did not have time to germinate and grow. My lord, you must know better than me that true love is not born overnight. We can fall in love at first sight, but at first it is a simple infatuation. Strong and sincere love must transcend those first moments of infatuation, and grow and strengthen in difficulties until, over time, it becomes a solid and sincere bond. From what you have told to me, love began to germinate and grow in the heart of your young lady, but you cut it off when you had to keep her away for the welfare of her, so you cut the stem of a plant that barely started to grow, but perhaps the roots were buried very deep. But then she met that other gentleman and she suffered an infatuation again, and another possible love began to germinate, but it was also cut off. Now it is possible that the love that she felt for you, it begins to grow again, that the buried roots begin to germinate again. But it will only be possible if you give it a chance. My lord, if you do not open your heart to that possibility will be impossible. Why not try, my lord? After all, you have nothing to lose. If love does not germinate, it will confirm your worst expectations, and you will have to learn to live with them. But if love has any chance, why not try? Said Catherine. You are very wise, Catherine, as well as beautiful. It's a pity we did not meet in another life, said Lord Melbourne, sincere and flattering. I'm very flattered, coming from you. Lord Melbourne, Catherine answered cautiously and a little nervous. Lord Melbourne opened his eyes and his face covered with a look of surprise and some fear, hearing his real name on Catherine's lips. The other day I happened to see you on the street and I went with a girlfriend, and that friend knew who you were and she told me. But do not worry, I swear on the life of my son that I have not told anyone, not even my closest friends, much less my boss. No one will find out for me, ever, they would have to torture me for me to confess. You are a gentleman and you have behaved very well with me, you made me feel special, something a man had not done for me in a long time. That's why, and because I know what it is to suffer for love and to need someone, I listened to you, that's why I would never betray you. I swear you on my son, Catherine declared with emotion and sincerity. I believe you, Catherine, for me you are a lady, an honorable lady. But you must understand my concern, you know that I'm going to marry the Queen, said Lord Melbourne nervously. I understand, Lord Melbourne. I do not care if the woman you told me about is the Queen or any other woman. The Queen is a woman with the feelings of any woman, with the weaknesses of any woman, but, she is the Queen, my Queen. I will be, what I am, but above all I am a loyal subject of Her Majesty. As far as I'm concerned, you've never talked to me about the Queen and that's all I know. Thank you, Catherine, Lord Melbourne answered. I just hope this does not mean the end of our encounters, Catherine said, fearing the answer. Lord Melbourne thought for a moment hesitantly, then answered. Do not worry, I think we'll keep seeing each other, Lord Melbourne said, making Catherine smile. Almost 2 days later, Lord Melbourne and his friend Lord George were arriving at Lord George's house in the English region of Cornwall. The carriage that carried them was approaching the entrance to the country mansion, a large and elegant 2-story house, built more than 100 years earlier, at the beginning of the 18th century. As a servant had gone on horseback to warn of the arrival of the master of the house, George's family was already waiting at the door. George almost did not wait for the carriage to stop to jump to the ground, and run to embrace a young woman and give her a kiss on the lips. Lord Melbourne smiled at the scene. Lord Melbourne was one of the few people in London's high society who knew the truth about Lord George's personal life. Most of the London aristocrats hardly knew that Lord George was separated from his wife and that by an unusual agreement between them she lived in Ireland and never went to England, as if she lived in a golden exile. But outside Cornwall few knew anything about their second family. Several years ago Lord George had fallen in love with a young maid, and both had begun a romance. Lord George gave to woman a status as if she were his wife, at least on his property in Cornwall, and that's why she reigned as lady of the house. They both had 3 children, a 5-year-old girl, a 3-year-old boy, and a girl of just under a year and a half. In spite of the great friendship between Lord Melbourne and Lord George, Lord Melbourne did not know the children of George's second family and did not even know his woman, for he had not yet brought them to London and Lord Melbourne had been too busy with his duties as Prime Minister, especially since Victoria was Queen, to visit Lord George's house in Cornwall. Lord Melbourne watched the woman curiously. She was a skinny girl, but with a beautiful silhouette, judging from what he could see or intuit in her long, fitted dress. She was a woman of medium stature, much taller than Victoria. It could be seen that her breasts were not large or small, perhaps a little larger than small, at least in proportion to her thin body. She was a woman of very white skin, almost pale, that stood out more in her dark blue suit. She had straight and black hair, which she carried long to her shoulders. Her face was more or less beautiful, but more normal than special or extraordinary. The most beautiful features were her beautiful blue eyes. The woman appeared to be over 25 years old, making her several years older than Victoria, but still much younger than George and Lord Melbourne. Approaching them, Lord Melbourne thought that with her elegant appearance the young woman could perfectly well resemble a young lady of the aristocracy. George turned and smiled at Lord Melbourne. "William, I'll introduce you to Eleanor." "Eleanor, my friend William," George said proudly. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Lord Melbourne," said the young woman, with a timidity, and in a reflex act, surely a memory of her times as a servant, began to make a bow more proper to a servant than to the lady of the house. "Eleanor, I told you not to do that." George reprimanded her, unable to avoid being annoyed at the sight of the woman she loved to humble herself, even if it was by mistake. "I'm sorry, George." Eleanor excused herself, very embarrassed, and for a moment Lord Melbourne feared she might cry. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Eleanor," said Lord Melbourne with sincere affection, and took the young woman's hand to kiss the back of the hand, chivalrously, saving the embarrassing situation. "We finally met. George has praised your beauty a lot, but now I see that his words, they have not done you justice. You are definitely a very beautiful woman, too beautiful for an ugly old man like George." "Thank you, Lord Melbourne," Eleanor replied, blushing and with a shy but beautiful smile. "In the old and foolish you make me, dear friend," George replied mockingly, and an amused smile. "Again good mood. These are the children. John," pointing to the little boy, who shyly hugged leg of his father, "that's the little Mary," he said, pointing to the little girl who was in the arms of a maid, and she saw Lord Melbourne with open eyes, curiously. "And my little princess, Elizabeth," he said, pointing to the eldest of the children, who stood beside of her mother. Mother and daughter looked a lot alike. "Say hello to Lord Melbourne, Elizabeth," Eleanor said to her eldest daughter, and the 5-year-old girl stepped forward. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Lord Melbourne," said the little girl, and bowed of a way more habitual for a lady of the aristocracy of a much greater age than hers, with an unusual safety and elegance for her age. Lord Melbourne smiled cheerfully and saw the smiles and gestures of pride of the girl's parents, and then he bent over and put one knee on the floor. "It's my pleasure, Lady Elizabeth," said Lord Melbourne, kissing the back of the hand of little girl, as if he were greeting a lady of the aristocracy several years older than her. "If you want, you can call me Uncle William." "If you want," said the girl, and hesitantly turned to see their parents, as if asking permission, and saw that they nodded. "All right, Uncle William," she added with a sweet smile. "Okay, niece. May I escort you in with your parents?" Lord Melbourne said affectionately, then took her by the hand to walk in behind the girl's parents. After dinner, George, Lord Melbourne, Eleanor, and the children shared a nice family time. The little boy slept in his mother's lap and the youngest of the girls in her father's lap, but the older girl was attentive to the conversation of the elders, sitting in a chair near Lord Melbourne. "Did you know that my daughter Elizabeth is a great admirer of Queen Victoria?" George asked with a smile. "Seriously?" asked Lord Melbourne, turning to look at Elizabeth, who looked down and blushed in embarrassment. "She collects everything about the Queen," Eleanor said, though she still seemed a bit shy. She spoke with more confidence in front of Lord Melbourne. "She has newspaper clippings with drawings or caricatures of the Queen, she has several portraits of the Queen that her father has given her, has dolls that she tries to dress in a similar way to the Queen, and each one calls her Her Majesty as if she were talking to the Queen. George says that she is a fan, a Queen Victoria fan, because what that girl really feels for the Queen is fanaticism rather than devotion," George said. "That is particular. When we were children we did not feel that devotion for our kings or princes," replied Lord Melbourne in astonishment. Who could we worship, William? When we were children the king was George III, an old man who afterwards went mad, and his sons, the princes, were bastards who deserved no admiration, George replied with a snort of disdain. George! Exclaimed Eleanor, and Lord Melbourne could see a change of temperament in the woman, that made him think that in private and with George she was not a woman so shy and submissive, but on the contrary could be a woman of strong character. Sorry dear. I know, in front of the children nothing of rude words, apologized George, embarrassed, and Lord Melbourne rejoiced to see that his friend behaved like a distressed child scolded by his mother. Uncle William, is it true that you are marrying the Queen? Asked little Elizabeth in her sweet, timid voice, taking Lord Melbourne by surprise. Yes, it's true. Well, when we can, Lord Melbourne said, looking at the little girl with paternal affection. And the Queen is very pretty? Asked Elizabeth, whose curiosity to know of her idol was greater than her timidity or the polite discretion her parents were instilling in her. Yes, in fact, she is much more beautiful than she appears in the portraits of her. I can assure you that she is 1,000 times more beautiful than she is in any of the portraits of her that your father has given you. It is as beautiful as you probably will be when you are her age. She has a beautiful face, beautiful eyes, and beautiful hair, answered Lord Melbourne, eager to please the little girl, but expressing what he really felt. The little girl smiled happily and excitedly. Uncle William, can you take me to meet the Queen? Elizabeth asked with childlike enthusiasm. Elizabeth! Exclaimed George and Eleanor, both scandalized and reprimanding the little girl, who reacted in embarrassment, bowing her head. Calm down, the girl did not ask for anything inappropriate. Exclaimed Lord Melbourne, addressing the parents of the little girl, and then turned to see the little girl. Of course, sweetheart. I promise you someday you'll meet Queen Victoria. I do not know when, and you might have to wait a lot of time, but I promise I'll see to it that you meet the Queen, added Lord Melbourne, speaking with great affection to the little girl, who smiled cheerfully. After a while, Eleanor withdrew with the children, and George and Lord Melbourne talked for a while, but then George also withdrew, and Lord Melbourne thought he was anxious to go to the bedroom where his woman was waiting. Then Lord Melbourne stayed until early morning drinking alone, and his mind was inevitably filled with depressed thoughts. He remembered his conversation with Victoria, and the images he imagined of Victoria making the love to Albert, again seized his mind, now conditioned by what Victoria had told him. His imagination recreated scenes of drunken Victoria losing her virginity with a drunken Albert too, and he could not help but feel indignant and sick. He who had believed that she was worthy of a first time beautiful, sublime, poetic, as in the imagination of romantic literature, that to lose virginity she should be honored as a goddess, loved with passion, delicacy, and tenderness, could not to accept that she had lost her virginity as a boorish and vulgar woman, drunk as the women of bad reputation who lived in the taverns. And again he felt tormented thinking that she was so in love with Albert that not only lost her virginity with him, but was eager to marry him. And where was he in her mind and in her heart if she was willing to marry another man and love him for the rest of her life? It tormented him to think that she did not love him, that she could forget him so easily, and that she could live a life without him and another man so happily. When he went to the bedroom, he made it, depressed, and lay on his back on the bed, not taking off his clothes, and unable to sleep. At dawn he had slept very little and his mood was very dark. After lunch George and Lord Melbourne went for a walk, and they came to the edge of a cliff that was in the lands of George. At the foot of the cliff was the sea, in a cove full of rocky promontories against which they beat strong waves. At that time the sky was a little cloudy, and a strong wind was blowing, making the sea more raging. George and Lord Melbourne stared at the beautiful, breathtaking view. "I'd like to run away from everything and leave problems and sorrow behind," Lord Melbourne said aloud, but as if speaking to himself. "Maybe you could do it, get on a boat on this coast and flee to France, and from there to anywhere in the world." "Of course, you would leave England behind in a storm," George said mockingly, but with a truthful background. "Or I could have an accident, slip and fall into the sea, a tragic accident that would put an end to all my troubles, Lord Melbourne said in a seemingly calm tone, but his brow furrowed and looking down at the bottom of the cliff. I'd say you have to be such a son of a bitch to go to a friend's property to commit suicide, George replied in a seemingly derisive tone, but with concern on his face, as if he feared that Lord Melbourne was really ready to jump and approaching with slow steps. George, when we were in the army you were never faster than me, I always beat you in speed, apart from other things, said Lord Melbourne with an ironic smile and a mocking tone, but still seeing the bottom of the cliff. But it does not mean I do not try, and if I fell on the precipice, you'd be guilty of leaving orphans to small children, George replied, coming a little closer. Lord Melbourne turned to face him and walked a few steps away from the edge of the cliff. Do not be silly, George. I'm kidding you, suicide would be too easy a way out, and I've never had the freedom to take the easy way, said Lord Melbourne, passing side George and away from him and the cliff. Let's go before you're the one who jumps to the void. You bastard! Cried George half seriously and half jokingly. The next day Lord George went to the courtyard behind the house, walking out of the kitchen door and found two men, one of them an employee of his service and the other a more particular man. He was a man of medium stature and very skinny, with very white skin, and curly hair and dark chestnut, a somewhat childlike face with prominent nose and big eyes. He was dressed elegantly, perhaps a little quirky or flashy, but not in excess. He was very young, but the most remarkable thing about him were his effeminate ways. Mr. Williams, it's a pleasure to meet you, George said, smiling and shaking the young man's hand. Lord George, it's my pleasure, too, Williams said in an effeminate voice that made George's employee, a stout, hard man, smile with irony and malice. Well, as I spoke with your boss, you will have everything necessary to carry out your mission, said George kindly. Okay, but I want to make something clear, Lord George. I do my work independently, even from my boss, and I certainly do not do it to please anyone, only the public, said the serious young man, all that allowed him his female behavior. Of course, I would not expect less from a professional like you, George replied honestly. And I really hope Lord Melbourne is not aware of this, said the young man. Young man, I have no habit to lie, and if I have told your boss that he does not know, it is he does not know. It is rude to doubt the host's word, the master of the house, George replied angrily and with an intimidating gesture on his face. Excuse me, Lord George. I apologize for my impertinence, replied the frightened young man. No problem. Peter, give the young man his clothes. Now you'll excuse me, I have to go back to my guest, George said. The other men waved at him with deference. When they was alone, George's clerk handed the elegant, effeminate young man a bundle of clothes, and the young man wrinkled his face when he saw it. That afternoon George insisted on taking Lord Melbourne to a field where there were trunks and axes, and then George took off his jacket and rolled up his shirt. What are you doing, George? Asked Lord Melbourne. What do you think? I'm going to split logs, and you'll help me, George replied. Are you crazy? Exclaimed Lord Melbourne. Why? Is Lady Melbourne too delicate to work as a man? Said George sarcastically. Do not be childish, George. You will not provoke me, Lord Melbourne answered. £15. I'll bet £15 that you're the first to get tired, George said cheerfully. I get tired, before you. Do not make me laugh. Lord Melbourne mocked. I am so convinced that I raise the bet at £20, George said, taking the axe. It will be like when we were kids and I always won you. That you always earned me. I see that age is making a dent in your memory. Lord Melbourne mocked, and began to take off his jacket and roll up his shirt. They both started to break trunks with enthusiasm, while close to them George's employee was with young Williams, who was dressed like a peasant. The two of them pretended to work ploughing the field, but young Williams did not take his eyes off Lord Melbourne. But after a while Williams looked bored. "William, take off your shirt," George said as he took off his own shirt, sweating a lot like his friend. Lord Melbourne saw one side and the other. "Easy, William. Only my employees can see us, your image will not be stained," replied George. Lord Melbourne removed his shirt, undressing his sweat-covered torso. When he did so, the young Williams was impressed and put a gesture in the face like that of a woman who looks with lust at a handsome, half-naked man. George's employee smiled with disdain and irony at the sight of him. For a while more George and Lord Melbourne broke trunks under the watchful gaze of young Williams, until George gave up before the rejoicing of Lord Melbourne. Then they went to the mansion, they bathed and dressed to go out again with Eleanor and the children. To Lord Melbourne's surprise, they went to a popular party organised by George's tenants, poor peasants. They mingled with them, and Lord Melbourne observed that George and his companion Eleanor were very dear to the tenants, and he too was pleased to see that people treated him with affection and admiration, knowing that he was the man who was most likely to become the consort of the Queen, apart being from the former Prime Minister. "What are we doing here, George?" Lord Melbourne asked in confusion, at a time when they were both alone. "Do you dislike it?" asked George seriously and inquisitively. "No, not necessarily, but I did not think." "What do you see around you, William? People like this? It's the one you've ruled for years. During the years that you were Prime Minister you had the lives of millions of people like these in your hands. For better or for worse they suffered the consequences of your decisions, their lives were conditioned by the measures that your ministers and you took from the government. It is good that you know these people a little, the British people, because they are also the subjects of Victoria, your future wife. You must know them, because more and more the future of the Queen and the whole country will depend on their support. Treat them with love and respect, and they will be loyal to you until death," George said sincerely. Following Lord George's advice, Lord Melbourne mingled with the poor peasants, and to his surprise he discovered that the company of many was more pleasant than the company of many aristocrats, and that he felt surprisingly comfortable talking to them in an atmosphere of camaraderie despite that they were very respectful of his superior social standing. Lord Melbourne enjoyed seeing people dancing and drinking around the bonfires on a starry night, though in his mind Victoria was always present. And out of the shadows young Williams did not take his eyes off of him, and often he would sneak up to hear how he talked to the tenants. The next day Lord Melbourne went to the beach with George and little Elizabeth. As George and his daughter barefoot slipped into the water up to the father's ankles and his daughter's knees, Lord Melbourne sat on some rocks and watched them with a sad smile. George played with the little girl, and he lifted her by putting her on his shoulders, lowering and raising her, while the little girl laughed happily. After a while they approached Lord Melbourne and chatted with him with laughter, while Williams watched them from a distance and took notes in a small notebook. And quickly, it was time to return to London, for the wedding process had to be hastened. Lord Melbourne bowed fondly to little Elizabeth, kneeling before her as he did to Victoria. "May I have the audacity to kiss you on the cheek, Lady Elizabeth?" asked Lord Melbourne. The little girl offered her the cheek to kiss, and he did it with tenderness. Lord Melbourne said goodbye affectionately at the rest of the family, especially Eleanor. Then he climbed into the carriage and watched as George said goodbye affectionately from his family, and as Eleanor let out a few tears, the children wept openly. George climbed into the carriage with damp eyes. After the carriage had advanced a little, Lord Melbourne spoke. "You should have stayed with your family longer," said Lord Melbourne. "Do not worry, I've decided to bring them to London. I got tired of hiding them. I want Elizabeth to receive a better education and prepare herself to have the best future possible, but first, I must make a few arrangements. And besides, I must serve England and secure the future of this country, making sure that you marry Victoria," George said as if he were speaking of a great patriotic service. "Well, I'm glad to know that my marriage and the fate of the country lie in your hands," exclaimed Lord Melbourne mocking but affectionate seriously. "You have given me much to think about this trip, George. I thank you from the bottom of my heart." The carriage continued on its way to London, while on a horse Williams was hurrying back to the British capital, overtaking Lord Melbourne and George.